everybody were to do this, we can prevent a large number of dementias. It's estimated to be somewhere around 40 to 50%.
Dementia as a whole mostly affects women more than men. Do you think there's like any correlation to what women were like in previous generations?
So absolutely. And I do actually, it's a short paragraph, but I try and make that case in the book. But one thing that I noticed when I was looking at all of these data, and as women have gained greater access to education, their cognitive function, when you measure on classic cognitive function tests, has improved and their risk of dementia has declined.
Dr. Tommy Wood is back.
When we're looking at like those supplements, how much of a role does this play in dementia as a whole?
We know that those who have poor vitamin status, poor omega-3 status, lower vitamin D, if they're anemic or they have low iron, all of those are associated with a significantly increased risk of dementia.
What's your thoughts on the ketogenic diet for brain health? Do you want to know what I'm really worried about after hearing this?
What?
AI. I don't know if you've seen the MIT study that came out, 47% decrease in brain connectivity.
So I think some of these concerns are valid and some of them will probably turn out to sort of be a bit overhyped. But it really does depend on how we engage in these processes. So if you think about this MIT study.
Hey guys, I am very bad at asking for this, but I wanted to stop for just 1 minute and ask a huge favor. If you want to hear more diverse conversations from female voices, such as myself, I would love if you could hit subscribe. We work so hard on this show to bring you some of the best guests in the world. And having a female voice sometimes gives a different perspective. And I really want to elevate more of that on this channel. So please hit subscribe if that's important to you, as it is to me. I want to talk about everything brain health, but our listeners will know exactly who you are because you've been on the show twice. So
Thanks
I look
for having me
back.
back.
Well, I'm so happy you're back in person because you were here in 2022 and then again in 2024.
Yeah.
So, you know, for the third time, we had to do it in person.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the biggest misconception on brain health that you want to start off with?
So I think the biggest misconception is probably what you started with earlier, which is that decline and dementia are in some way inevitable. And just to give people a little bit of grounding, dementia is essentially an umbrella term for a number of diseases or disorders that result in the loss of cognitive function such that you can no longer look after yourself sort of on a day-to-day basis. The most common cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. And the second most common cause is vascular dementia, which is caused by issues with blood vessels in the brain. But there's actually a huge amount of overlap between the two. So most people who have Alzheimer's disease also have some vascular disease or some issues with blood flow to the brain, very similar to the process that goes on in the heart that causes heart disease. So between them, they make up something like 70 to 90% of all dementias. And those are the dementias that are now generally considered to be preventable, at least somewhere around half of those cases.
Okay, so you just said something really key there, which is preventable. So my grandmother had Alzheimer's. So I'm always terrified, as my siblings are, and my mum, that we might get dementia because it might run in the family and Alzheimer's. If you do have a genetic risk, is it still can you still prevent that? So say you get your DNA results back, which everyone was doing like 5 years ago, and they're like, yeah, you have the genetic kind of snip for Alzheimer's. Is it still preventable?
So there's multiple different types of genetic risks for Alzheimer's disease. So maybe we should go through them one by one. So the original Alzheimer's disease, which when Alzheimer first described them was a collection of slightly obscure and very rare dementias that occurred in younger individuals. So before then, we called what is now Alzheimer's disease, we called it senile dementia, which is essentially just dementia that occurs in old age, so after 65 years old. The cases that Alzheimer looked at were cases of dementia in individuals who are younger than that, sort of 30 to 50. Those tend to be, if they're early onset, as we call them, Alzheimer's disease, or familial Alzheimer's disease, they're caused by a single genetic mutation to a number of genes like the presenilins, presenilin 1 and 2, or the amyloid precursor protein. And those account for maybe 1% of Alzheimer's cases. And they have a much more predictable course. They tend to onset in something like the 30s to 50s, and then there tends to be a relatively rapid decline after that. There are people who say they've worked with individuals who have those types of mutations, and at least have managed to slow decline through the use of lifestyle. But that's not really the kind of dementia that we're talking about. What we're talking about is late onset or sporadic Alzheimer's, which is 99% of cases. That's, if you had a family member with Alzheimer's, that's probably the type of Alzheimer's that they had. Then there are two, again, types of genetic risk we might talk about. One is related to the ApoE genotype. So ApoE4 is probably the single most common polymorphism that increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease. For those who don't know, apolipoprotein E is a protein that helps to traffic fats through the body. You have two copies, and you can have one of three types: 2, 3, or 4. If you have one copy of ApoE4, you have something like a 2 to 6 times increase of risk of Alzheimer's disease. And if you have two copies, it's something like 6 to 20 times on average. So we know that having or carrying at least a copy of ApoE4 increases risk of Alzheimer's disease in sort of modern westernized societies, but that's not necessarily the case around the globe. So there have been studies in the Bolivian Chimene, who are a hunter-gatherer group, in certain Native American groups, in the Nigerian Yoruba. In those studies, those individuals didn't have an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. And there's even some data to suggest that people of Italian heritage, so Sicilian Italian heritage, those, when they're in Sicily, ApoE4 is not associated with an increased risk, or the risk is much smaller, but then the risk is much larger once people of the same ancestry are in the US. So this suggests that even for ApoE4, there's an environmental component. And most of the evidence suggests that ApoE4 is mainly a risk multiplier. So we know what some of the risk factors are for Alzheimer's disease. They include smoking, alcohol, poor diet, sedentary lifestyle. In those who have at least one copy of ApoE4, that risk seems to be magnified, but then they may also benefit more if they make those lifestyle changes. So you can never promise that by doing those things, you can completely eliminate all the risk, but all the evidence suggests that if you recreate or manipulate your environment such that you remove those risk factors, or you moderate those risk factors as much as possible, you've probably reduced the risk associated with having a copy of ApoE4 quite significantly. Then the final sort of genetic risk could be like a polymorphic risk. So
What's that?
So we know that lots of genes can sort of add up in little ways to increase your risk of dementia. So they have these things called polygenic risk scores, which might be hundreds or thousands of genes, and each one just adds like a tiny little bit. So when you look at those who have high polygenic risk, so they might not have ApoE4, but just like lots of little risks add up, then again, regardless of your polygenic risk, you can still have a significant impact on your risk of dementia by making certain lifestyle changes. So pretty much across the spectrum of genes, dementia still seems to be preventable. And by that, I mean that at a large population level, if everybody were to do this, we can prevent a large number of dementias. It's estimated to be somewhere around 40 to 50%. Some people say it could be more than that. So you can't promise one person that they could completely eliminate their risk, but you can substantially reduce your risk no matter what your genes are.
I think that's just hope, because I think it's one of the most scariest diseases to think about, and also for family members as well. When I was delivered that my grandmother had Alzheimer's, not only were we so sad for her, but also like watching my mum go through it. It's also like a horrible disease for the family to encounter, but it's hopeful that we can do so much about it. It's interesting because you said environment, and when I look at the blue zones, there's one area of the blue zones where like no women have dementia at all, hardly, which is really, really interesting, because dementia as a whole mostly affects women more than men. Am I right in saying that?
Alzheimer's disease, yes.
Okay.
So around 2/3 of the individuals impacted by Alzheimer's disease are women. Vascular dementia is about 50-50.
Oh, really?
So the total dementia burden is greater in women, but it depends on the type of dementia.
Do you know like why that is? Because I mean, obviously I've been really interested about all the work that you're doing on
making sure we got to stimulate the mind. Like I remember when we last spoke, you told me to like learning a new language is really important. My dyslexic brain got very stressed about that part. But, you know, making sure that you're keeping up new daily tasks, which I want to talk about, especially with your new book that's coming out, which even the title, The Stimulated Mind, tells you that we've got to keep stimulating it. But it made me think about women previously when they, you know, women used to be housewives and look after children, be caretakers, doing everything at the household. And maybe they weren't as stimulated as the men in the family who were going to work and having to provide. Do you think there's like any correlation to what women were like in previous generations?
It's a short paragraph, but I try and make that case in the book. So one thing that people don't necessarily appreciate, because every time we talk about dementia, it's always doom and gloom, and the burden of dementia is expected to double or triple in the next few decades, largely just because we're living longer. But people don't realize that actually the age-specific incidence or risk of dementia has decreased over the last 6 or 7 decades. So if you look at what your risk of getting dementia was at 60 or 70 years old in the 30s or 40s, 1930s, 1940s, that risk has steadily been declining. And they've shown that in multiple countries, in multiple studies. And there are a few reasons for why that could be the case. One is nutrition has improved. A big thing when you sort of read these studies, the authors hypothesize that part of it is because we've become really good at treating heart disease, and the risk factors for heart disease overlap with the risk factors for dementia. But one thing that I noticed when I was looking at all of these data, and I'll tell you about one specific study that really made me think about this, is that it's only really been since sort of 1960s, 1970s that women have really entered the workforce, have been able to get access to these higher, more complicated, more stimulating jobs, as well as being able to get better access to education. And that's true in the US, in the UK, but also around the world in general. And as women have gained greater access to education, their cognitive function, when you measure on classic cognitive function tests, has improved and their risk of dementia has declined. So there's no randomized trial that tells you that this is the case, but the data certainly seem to suggest that. One study that really sort of opened my eyes on a number of fronts of this was run out of the University of Washington, which is where I now work, called the Seattle Longitudinal Study, run by Warner Shai. And it was one of the first studies where they didn't just take a whole group of people and measure their cognitive function and look at, you know, average cognitive function by age, which is what a big population study might do. It was one of the first studies to take the same people and measure their cognitive function regularly over decades. So he got people, they came in every 7 years, and some people were in this study for several decades. So there are people from, you know, teens up to more than 100 years old by the end of the study. And it ran for, 40 or 50 years. And one of the early studies they did from, this huge collection of data that they got, looked at something they called environmental complexity. So it was, this is beginning in the 50s, and the cognitive function test was sort of derived in the 50s and 60s. And so we have much more detailed ways of measuring those things now. One of the first studies they did, looking at all these data from this study, looked at something called environmental complexity. And this is something that we can study in a much more detailed way now, because this study was started in the 1950s. But what they did is they looked at the way that people's brains were stimulated and how they engaged with the environment. So that included their jobs, it included their level of education, it included other types of social interaction. And they found that those with the highest amounts of what they called environmental complexity had the greatest likelihood of maintaining stable cognitive function for decades into the future. And this study actually showed that on average, people maintained cognitive function from their 50s into their 80s. It was not this rapid decline that everybody expected. And it was data from the Seattle Longitudinal Study that was used, or partly used, to raise the retirement age in the US in the 1980s, because they showed that actually people could maintain, the average was to maintain cognitive function into your 80s, which is not necessarily what people expect. And this was published back in the sort of 70s and 80s. But when looking at environmental complexity, one of the groups that had the lowest environmental complexity and also the greatest declines in cognitive function over time were housewives. And that this is no comment on people who choose to take that type of role, right? It's just that if you're not getting access to education or getting access to these other cognitively stimulating environments that come through work, you might be socially isolated because you spend all day at home alone. And this was a role that was largely filled by women back in the 1950s and 60s. And so I think that you're right. I think that the fact that this has changed over the last few decades is part of the reason why we've seen dementia decline. And it's not the total burden of dementia that's declining. It's that at 60 years old, what's your risk of getting diagnosed with dementia? At 70 years old, what's your risk of getting diagnosed with dementia? At any given age, your risk is lower, but because we're living longer and, unfortunately, the health of the population is now getting worse again, risk is starting to increase. But I think that the fact that the role of women in society has changed has actually contributed to benefit for their brains and overall lower risk of dementia, at least over the past few decades.
Yeah, I just think it's such an interesting comparison because I think when I've spoken about dementia in the past, I've always connected it to perimenopause and menopause with the drop in estrogen and how that's also a risk factor for dementia. But I don't know, when I was just reading this and I just started thinking about the downstream effects of women when we weren't allowed to have jobs. You've got like the biggest cohort there ever because so many women didn't have any availability to go out and work. And so, I mean, now we do, but that's a different conversation. But I do think it's really interesting that can kind of be one argument against talking about stimulation. And you mentioned something really interesting there, which was retirement. Because this kind of links in to the whole premise of talking about keeping your mind strong.
Yeah.
So I have my parents are, my mum's not in her 70s yet, but my dad's just gone into his 70s. And he keeps saying the language like, I'm old. Yeah. I'm old, oh gosh, I'm old now. And I get a very frustrated daughter going, don't use that language. This is negative self-talk. He doesn't like it and he kind of carries on. He's very positive as a whole, but he does use this terminology. And I always say, this is going to make you be old. This is going to make you lose your cognitive functioning in a very overarching term. Is there any truth to believing that when you hit a certain age that you just naturally are going to be worse of these things? And so actually that does have a compounding effect or not?
So I think so, absolutely. Because it changes the activities that you engage in. And actually, there's a small but very nice study that was done by Ellen Langer, whose work you might be familiar with.
She's been on the show.
Fantastic. I love her work. And so she might have talked about this study where she went into care homes. This is one of the first studies she did and went into care homes in the 70s, right? And so they had two groups. One group where they were sort of given more agency over their lives. They had a planter. They were given a plant they had to look after. They were told that they could do what they wanted, see who they wanted. They were sort of given control of their lives versus the group where they're like, we're here to look after you. We'll look after this plant. You just sit there, you don't have to do anything, right? And then the latter group obviously have a faster decline in health. And though it wasn't really designed to look at this, they seemed to die earlier, right? And when Ellen was writing about those studies, she talks about this idea of stereotype embodiment theory, which is that you embody, it does exactly what it says on the tin, you embody the stereotypes that you believe in. So if you think you're too old to do something, then you won't do that thing anymore. And it's the not doing that thing that causes you to become old or for, to aging to continue or accelerate rather than the fact that more years have passed. So if you think about, we've talked about stimulation a little bit already. Stimulating the body through physical activity and exercise is the single most important way to slow the processes of aging in the physical body. It counteracts all of the known hallmarks of aging, these biochemical changes that we know happen with age. And stimulating your neural tissue, for want of a better word, essentially does exactly the same thing in the brain. And there's a huge amount of biological and physiological overlap with what happens in the cells when you stimulate them when you stimulate your brain cognitively or stimulate your body physically, that helps to maintain repair processes, help to generate or regenerate tissue. And this then becomes self-fulfilling. This aging process becomes self-fulfilling if you stop engaging in those processes. So if you think, oh, I'm too old to lift weights, I'm too old to play tennis, I'm too old to learn a new language, it's the not doing those things that then creates that self-fulfilling prophecy. So telling yourself you're too old, thinking that you're too old, and then not doing the things that prevent the aging process, or at least slow the aging process down, then causes that to happen. So that's why thinking that way can then end up in you essentially aging faster.
It's so interesting because it makes me, I mean, I think I read a bit about this in your book, but about the self-determination theory, which is basically like making sure that we have enough autonomy, which is critical for our well-being, which I think actually if your autonomy goes and you can't actually access things, you do actually feel less in control. And that makes me think about autonomy in aging. Like how much do you think that does play? Like if you were to put things into pillars, how much does that play in a central role to dementia and Alzheimer's?
I mean, it plays a huge role throughout our entire lives. One, because when we lose control, we lose autonomy. It's inherently very stressful. That creates a chronic stress condition that we know can contribute to long-term chronic disease. But equally, not all of it is out of our control. Sort of like when you're talking about this process of thinking, oh, I'm too old, I'm old, you're essentially giving up autonomy. You're like giving it over to this other process. But like, well, I'm old, and therefore aging is just going to do this regardless, right? So you're giving up control that we're actually you don't need to. So, having some agency here and staying engaged in this process is really critical.
As someone who has spent a long time studying the mind-body connection, I'm constantly asked, what do I use to track my health? Since April, you've probably seen, if you're watching the show, me wearing a piece of tech on my arm, and that is No Watch, because I genuinely believe it has been one of the most thoughtful and mind-aware pieces of tech that you can wear. Unlike most wearables that focus just on your steps or your sleep, No Watch is a bit different. It gives you real-time insights into your nervous system, the invisible engine that calibrates everything from your stress to your sleep to your recovery, your rest, and ultimately your health. With its stress recovery metric, it doesn't just show you how long you were stressed for, but also how long you recovered. It shows you your homeostasis. And that to me is where real health begins. And I think it's all something that we're craving. And most importantly, it does this without dragging you back to your phone, because that motion just depletes you. It delivers meaningful health insights to you only when something genuinely matters, using AI to turn complex signals into clarity that you can understand. And in just 5 days, it calibrates to your body and creates your personalized health fingerprint. You can try it for 30 days completely free. And if you're curious, now's the time, because they're giving you guys 15% off with my code LWBW15 if you head to nowatch.com. And you guys know, as listeners of Live Well Be Well and this whole community, that understanding yourself in the most mindful way is one of the most powerful things that you can do for your health. And this little gadget helps you on your journey.
Yeah, well, I think about it because I know, obviously, you love the gym. Anyone who's watching this on YouTube will also see that you very much like the gym.
I do love the gym, you're right. Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting. I think you said to me before, like you actually got into, part of your work was because you loved going to the gym and understanding about that. And then obviously the mind is with our muscles are so important for our mind.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess if you feel that there's a restriction of you going to the gym because you're getting older and you don't want to lift weights, it's a similar process to the mind. That's how I'm kind of understanding it.
Yeah. So I often think about this in terms of like the full trajectory of your cognitive function and your brain development, essentially starting right from birth. Or, you could even argue that some of this starts before birth.
In utero,
or even before that, even before conception. But when you think about the brain developing, the first few years, you're essentially growing that brain. And then from about 3 to 5 years old, your brain is still developing. But when we think about development, we usually think about growth, but it's actually not. What the brain is doing is it's taking all the inputs you're giving it and refining itself down. So that includes removing parts, removing synapses, removing connections that are no longer needed. And some people, there are lots of theories about what aging actually is. And some people theorize that it's just a continuation of normal development, right? So actually the body is continuing to do all the things that it was doing as it develops, but it just continues for decades and decades. And what eventually happens is that results in physical decline. So luckily, the way I think about this is right no matter which theory of aging you have. So, but if it was this theory of aging, then imagine that your brain improves its function based on all the sort of the complex stimuli that you give it. So that's learning motor control. So like, you think about a toddler trying to learn how to orient this meat sack in 3D space, right? It's incredibly difficult. And then learning language, learning social interaction. Then you go to school and you're learning maths or math, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on, and history and physics and all these things. And as you're doing that, the brain is constantly refining its function. It's activating all these different networks. It's stabilizing those networks. It's strengthening all these connections and all these different functions. And that's what continues essentially until you leave school, right? So there are lots of studies that suggest that your cognitive function peaks later and higher if you spend longer in school, or if you have higher educational attainment. So attainment is important because it's not like just like sitting in a desk in a room makes your brain get better, right? You have to actually sort of engage in that process and reach those milestones.
Similar like going to a gym. You got to really like do the work.
You can't just like sit on the bench and not do anything and then expect to get stronger. So cognitive function tends to peak around the time that you leave formal education. And on average, that's higher if you spend longer in education. Sort of the peak is higher. But then after that, if you think that the brain is continuing to refine itself and maintain its function based on the inputs that it gets, what we do after we leave school tends to be decreasing the number of complex inputs that our brain gets, right? We can get lots of cognitive stimulation from work, but usually we're specializing. We're doing the same thing again and again and again and again. We're no longer sort of pushing the boundaries of what our brains might be capable of, which essentially is your brain's job for the first 2 or 3 decades of its life. And so you can make the argument that the reason why cognitive function declines on average as we get older is because we stop engaging in these active learning processes because, we're busy. Like we've got jobs and kids and all these other things that stop us from learning new skills or learning new languages or taking up new sports or, going out and spending time with friends, right? And social interaction. And so I think some of the decline that we see is just because we stop doing these things that we did when we were kids and teenagers and we were actively developing our brains. And then when we remove those inputs, the brain is essentially just balancing its requirements. So I'm like, well, I don't need this bit anymore because I'm not using it. And then as a result, those bits get pared back and decline happens over the next few decades. So then you can just think about, well, how do I build these things back in, which is a window into maintaining function, ideally for decades longer than we thought was possible.
Do you want to know what I'm really worried about after hearing this?
What?
AI.
Yeah. Which it is a valid concern.
It is, because in one way, AI is amazing because there's so many things that it can help enhance your work with. I mean, I use it through so many of like my core operations now. It's like integral. I kind of forgot what life was like without it, which is worrying. But if you're not in that camp, you're behind, right? And so I then, I wanted to look into this like very briefly, but I don't know if you've seen the MIT study that came out and showed that after 4 months of ChatGPT use, 83% of users couldn't recall sentences they'd just written, with a 47% decrease in brain connectivity. And I remember reading that and then asking ChatGPT more information about it. But it's this weird world where you were just saying, we peak cognitively as we leave school, but our kids now just going to be using AI to get through school. Like there's so many interesting conversations that kind of coming out of what you're just saying, talking about, you know, the autonomy to use your mind, to test it, to push it, to learn new things, to stimulate it as much as possible. But now we've got this technological world that's coming out that is kind of taking away any of that creativity and just giving you the answer in seconds. Like, what do you think that's going to do to our brains? This isn't to sound also very unhopeful. It's just,
No,
that sounded like a really horrible question where I was like leading you in for complete dismay. But
it's so funny because I think that there have been, obviously we haven't been a part of them, but there have been these discussions every time there's been a major technological revolution, right? So I think some of these concerns are valid, and some of them will probably turn out to sort of be a bit overhyped. But it really does depend on how we engage in these processes. So if you think about this MIT study, or at least there have been a couple of MIT studies, but the most referenced one is this one where they had individuals write essays. And there were several groups. And I will say, I still don't think this paper has been, you know, at the time that we record this, the paper hasn't been formally published yet. It's just released as a preprint, which is sort of, you put it out there before it goes through peer review and all this kind of stuff. And I'm sure it will be at some point soon.
Thank you for mentioning that. It's a good point you mentioned that.
I also guarantee that most people talking about this study have not read this study, because the full paper is somewhere over 200 pages long. It's a very long paper. So like most people
have ChatGPT'd it. They've like run it through.
Do you know what? Actually, in the paper, there's an Easter egg which only LLMs can read, and it like gives instructions to an LLM for like summarizing the paper. It's quite funny because they know that most people are only just going to run it through ChatGPT. Anyway, so they had students write essays, and there were some who just had to just like write essays based on the knowledge that they have. Some were allowed to use Google, and then some were allowed to use ChatGPT. And what they showed was that as you sort of increase the amount of assistance that you could get from technology, so Google through to ChatGPT, the less students remembered of their work and the less they felt like the work was their own. None of this is surprising, right? If you didn't engage your brain in the process, like you're not going to remember it as well, and you're not going to feel as much ownership of it. However, they did later on sort of switch. They did switch groups around. So sometimes groups went from one to the other, and so some groups that previously wrote by hand then wrote using ChatGPT afterwards. And they actually found that if they tried to write the essay first and then they wrote the essay again with the help of ChatGPT afterwards, they developed a better overall answer because they already had a framework that they developed, and then they were just using ChatGPT to sort of improve it. So what this kind of says is that the amount that you engage your brain in the process will then determine how your brain is functioning, or determine what your final outcome and how much that has actually made any difference to you personally. This is not a surprise. So I don't know why everybody was wringing their hands out of it. If you ask something else to write you an essay, you won't feel like that essay was your work and you won't remember it. That's not surprising at all. But it does kind of give you this hint that you can use some of these tools to augment your skills and thinking processes, as long as you actually engage your thinking processes in the first place. So I think, right now with technology sort of accelerating at a pace that we can't predict, and this is why you sort of mentioned future-proofing, like I don't know what the landscape is going to look like in 1 year, let alone 10 years or 20 years. But if we think about as technology comes forward, you can just think about this. So I have a simple heuristic, which is this thing augmenting skills that I want to have and I need to have, or is it causing them to atrophy? As in, I am just like giving the jobs to the LLM and my brain isn't engaged in it at all. And that's okay if there are just some things that you don't need to maintain as skills and they take up a lot of your time, and a chatbot can do it better. Fine. But I would argue that there are some skills that we're giving up that we would probably like to maintain. Like, I get emails from my colleagues that are very clearly written by ChatGPT, and I refuse to do that. Even though it takes me more time, I want to still be able to craft a nice, personalized, truly from me email to my colleagues. I think that's incredibly important, right? Especially because that's a communication tool we use all the time. And when I know that I'm being sent ChatGPT emails, right, that makes me think slightly less of, just automatically makes me think, or slightly differently of the person who sent it. And then equally, you get into the scientific fields, and I also have colleagues who are using ChatGPT to analyze their data and write their papers. And at this point, you're no longer a scientist, right? You are not developing or maintaining your scientific skills. You're just letting AI do it for you. So if you're a scientist, these are incredibly critical skills. If you start to give them up, then you're no longer going to be able to have those necessary skills to do high quality research. So the alternative is you can use AI to help you do some things faster, but still require you to engage your own brain in that process. So I use ChatGPT to write statistical code for me. So I do a lot of data analysis from the work in my lab. All the work in my lab is done by real humans, hands-on stuff. It can't be automated. You can't have ChatGPT do it for you. I have my students design their own experiments, analyze their own data. But if you're trying to write complex machine learning code in R or Python, it might take you several hours to, you want the output, right? You're thinking about the input, you're generating the data, you know what you want to get out of it. That can shorten a step by several hours. I think that's fine because you're still engaged in the full scientific thinking processes that are required to do that work. So it really just comes down to thinking about, are you able to improve, or are you giving up skills that you actually really want to maintain? And that's then going to apply to whatever technology we have ahead of us. So you can still, dramatically upskill, but it just requires you to make sure that you're still engaging in these processes and not giving up these things to the LLM or whatever it is that comes next.
It's true. It's like, the word that I was looking for when I was trying to describe that was critical thinking. And there is a member of my team who is a nutrition student. She's in her last year. And we had a neuroscientist on here called TJ Power who was speaking to us about dopamine and like phone and stimulation. And she said to me that when she's in her university lecture, like 90% of kids are on just ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Just the whole day. I am just really interested to see I think it's not that far till we have chips in our brain. And I'm like, what does that mean about our kind of future for cognitive decline or cognitive enhancement? Like, we just don't quite know. But I don't feel like we're that far away from this happening.
So there are a few things again that come up. So one that we didn't cover yet was you worried about kids in schools, and there's huge pushback now in several countries and counties across the US, or at least at least individual schools, and now it started to gather momentum where there's just no phones in the school whatsoever, right? Some schools are even going back to like pen and paper tests. They're getting rid of tablets. I don't know what this will look like on a global scale, but people are starting to appreciate that at least during these critical periods of learning, there's something magic about actually writing it down by hand, and there's something magic about engaging with the teacher and with your fellow pupils. So I think people are starting to understand that, and we're starting to wind some of that back. So I'm a little bit less fatalistic around that because there's been such a big push, and I think some of that will change, and we'll just use the technology maybe in a slightly more targeted way. When you then think about your bigger technological advancements, I think that what's interesting to me is that some of the most promising technologies when it comes to at least treating neurodegenerative disorders, maybe recoveries after strokes, recovering senses after we've lost them, actually just involve directly stimulating the brain. And that can be with electrical signals, with magnetic fields, with light. There's still a huge amount to be done there, but I think really some of the most powerful upcoming technologies come just from directly stimulating the neural tissue. And what you're doing is you're doing exactly the same thing. You're just like pushing energy through the system. By doing that, you're activating the mitochondria. By doing that, you're stimulating all these maintenance and repair processes. So even though they're external, you're still leveraging that basic principle of stimulus being the thing that's really critical to brain function. So I don't necessarily mind how we get there. I would prefer, if it was you going to the gym and doing some bicep curls and then going to a language class or a dance class. But, if the net effect is that we see less cognitive decline, we see more recovery from strokes, then, I'm good with it.
You mentioned something there. We're still on. I know you have 3 models. Well, the 3S model, and we're still on stimulation. But there's so much in stimulation to get through that I'm staying on it.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned something there that was really interesting: sensors. And I loved finding out about the importance of hearing and smell. And I think we're so acute to understanding about touch, but there's a lot of people that are very connected to smell, and that I remember taking rosemary into all of my exams and using that. How much kind of research? I mean, it's kind of very nuanced, but that was really and it also calms me. Like when I have sensory smell, I find I'm very connected to that. I always think about losing your sight or your hearing and how much effect that's going to have on you. And there's quite a lot of research here, there isn't there? So like, how important is it to keep up maintenance with our hearing and our eyesight? Because I don't know when the last time I had a hearing test or an eyesight test, but I probably should do after reading your book. So like, why is this so important?
There's a few different reasons why this might be important. And it also goes back to what you mentioned earlier, which is, that kind of that experience of getting older. And some of the ways that we either we sort of lean into it, maybe not a good way, and some of the ways that we resist it, and again, not necessarily in a good way. So you'll often have people who, as they start to lose their hearing, right, you get this age-related loss of hearing called presbyacusis. They might be like, well, I'm just going to muddle through it, right? Because once I have a hearing aid, then I'm definitely old.
And
right?
Also, by the way, I don't just think it's people getting older. My old producer, he is in his 30s and he's losing his hearing because he's worked with audio so much. So I know quite a few people in their 30s who are saying to me in the next couple of years, I need a hearing aid.
Yeah. And there's also some interesting data just starting to come out on constantly using noise cancelling headphones because you're no longer processing sound in the normal way. And I don't yet want to sort of ring the alarm on that because we don't necessarily know, but there's certainly some doctors who are kind of worried about that, particularly with kids who just never learn how to process or filter out sound. So then, when they're out in the world without noise cancellation, it's very overwhelming because there's just so much noise that they never really learn to sort of how to filter out. So there's so much that comes into the brain through our eyes and through our ears, and a huge part of what the brain does is actually filter that stuff out. So you need to learn how to and train the brain to do that. But then once you start to lose those senses, a few things happen. So one could be that, and so we know that people who have hearing loss or who have eyesight loss, for instance, with cataracts, they have an increased risk of later dementia. And sort of observational studies, where you sort of look at people who did and didn't get cataract surgeries, those who do get cataract surgeries that risk seems to be reversed. So if you have cataracts, you have an increased risk of dementia. If you get cataract surgery, that risk is completely mitigated.
Because you're bringing back in the
because you're
stimulus.
bringing the stimulus back in.
Wow.
They haven't done randomized control trials of that, but they have done it for hearing aids. And for those who are at a high risk of dementia because of cardiovascular disease or other physical health issues, if you have hearing loss and you get hearing aids, getting the hearing aids significantly decreases your risk of dementia, which would otherwise be increased because of your loss of hearing.
So rather than resisting,
right,
which people can do also with glasses and being like, oh, I don't want to because I don't even know if this is true, but I've heard so many people say, well, if I get glasses, my sight's going to decline even more. So they kind of resist getting glasses. And I'm sure it's very similar to hearing aids. I'll just put up with it.
Yeah. So there's two different parts to it. So one is actually there is some evidence to suggest that particularly as your eyesight changes, if you try to some of those changes are due to the kind of the eye ages, so the shape changes slightly, it gets a little bit stiffer. But then part of it is muscular as well. And if you're not using full ranges of your vision, then the vision that you have will kind of constrict in terms of the full range possible. So you can potentially retrain some of that by sort of trying to look at the kind of the edges of your current limits of focus. It's not magic. You can't prevent that entirely, but some of it is neuromuscular, and that means that you can train it. So some vision changes with age, we can probably slow down just by how we use our eyes, i.e. just like not staring at a screen in front of us the whole day, spending some time looking further afield, occasionally at more complex things. And so that's part of it. But then, so as you start to lose sight and hearing, one thought is that those losing senses increases the risk of dementia because you're just no longer getting those direct inputs in, and the brain's like, well, I'm not getting any information to this part of the brain, so I'm just not going to maintain that area of the brain. So that's part of it. But then probably a bigger part is that as you lose those senses, you stop doing certain things, right? So if you can't hear as well, you're less likely to go out into busy social places because it's harder for you to carry on a conversation. Or if you start to lose your eyesight, you're less likely to go out at night, or you're less likely to go out and do certain things, drive a car. And so you get fewer of those inputs that we know are critical for maintaining brain function. So it's probably the combination of those two things that's really important. It's very similar with physical function. As you get weaker, you're more frail, you feel less physically capable, you go out of the house less, you don't carry your shopping anymore, right? And again, it's by stopping doing those activities, then the decrease in function accelerates.
I'm interrupting for one moment to ask one small favor. Please subscribe to the show. This helps it grow more than you know. And I'm so bad at asking this from you. I'm so bad at thinking about this. But my goal is 100,000 to get to on YouTube. And I really want to bring you more content and better guests and bigger episodes. And we can only do that with your help together. So please do hit subscribe. Thank you. I'm obviously feel fine with my eyes in it, but I'm still now like, I really should go and get an eye test just to check. Does it change if people get like laser eye treatment and things? Because that's been such a big thing in the last 10 years. I
actually haven't seen any evidence of that. It may be because people tend to have that earlier in life. And I think what's important is that, so like you say, I haven't had an eye test yet. If you haven't noticed that your eyesight has changed such that it's changing what you're doing, then you're fine. Then you're probably fine. Just like if you never had a sense in the first place, like if you were born congenitally deaf, that doesn't automatically increase your risk of dementia because you have other ways of interacting with the world that will allow you to get those normal stimuli. So it's the loss of a sense and then the change in behavior that comes with that.
Smell, is that a thing?
So smell is
COVID.
Yeah. And there were some people that think that part of the reason you get the sort of post-COVID change in cognitive function and brain fog is because you no longer have that sense of smell that lots of people lost. Most people got it back, but some people had persistent changes in smell, and that was maybe part of the picture of like the long COVID. There is one study that actually used smell and has significantly improved cognitive function in a group of older adults. They had an essential oil diffuser that they had by their bed during while they slept. They had 7 different smells that they rotated through, like one a night. So one a night every week, and they rotated for 6 months. And they saw significant improvements in cognitive function compared to a control group. And they also did brain imaging and saw significant changes. I think it related to areas of the hippocampus, which is really important for cognitive, particularly with memory as we get older. So just novel smell as a stimulus seemed to improve cognitive function. Again, this is in older adults. So exposing yourself to a wide range of new smells may be another way to continue to stimulate the brain.
I know what I'm getting my parents for Christmas.
So the group that the academics who ran the trial, they now have a device that you can buy that does this, but it's quite expensive.
How much?
I think it's like $800, whereas a $20 essential oil diffuser that you could just like put by your bed would work just as well.
Okay,
so
fine.
You can get like the fancy version, but I think just a regular essential oil diffuser will do the job in exactly the same way.
So before I move on to the next part, which is really important, I have to ask you about owls.
Oh yeah.
People are like, where's she going with this? But you know why I'm asking you about owls.
Yeah.
Tell me, why do you love owls? Not elves, owls. Owls so much.
So my entire book is written based on human studies in humans. As much as possible of it is randomized controlled trials. Like, obviously that's not possible with everything, like some of the things we've already talked about.
But generally, like hierarchy of evidence you're looking at.
As much as possible, every study that I cite in the book, of which there are nearly 2,000, is from humans. But the preface of the book talks about owls, which kind of sets everything up, and I think shows exactly the same things that you then sort of expand upon in the book. But there were a series of studies done by a group at Stanford, Eric Knudsen and his colleagues, with barn owls back in the sort of 80s and 90s. And what they did is they took owls and then onto their heads, they kind of glued these little prism glasses. And what the glasses do, so like anybody who's familiar with a prism, it shifts light, right? So you have these prism glasses on. And so when you're looking straight ahead, what you might see and what you think is straight ahead is actually shifted slightly to the left or right. And they did a series of experiments. First, they showed that if you were a young owl and you put on these prism glasses, you would adjust really easily, right? You'd figure everything out, and then you would just go about your daily business, no problem whatsoever. And then,
as an owl does,
and then catching mice and things, which is an important part of the study. Actually, is the catching of mice. But then they put the glasses on older owls, and they couldn't adapt, right? And so this sort of lends us to this traditional thought, so the old brain can't change, can't learn, right? These are sort of like the old dogs who can't learn new tricks. But what really transpired was that the old brain just needs a reason to change, right? So as you've spent decades developing in your environment, your brain has become optimally adapted for you to perform well in the environment that you have. So you don't want it to just change on a whim, right? It's really important that your brain be good at the things that you need it to be good at. So when you're an owl sitting by yourself in a cage and your food is kind of just, you dead mice are put in the bottom of your cage and you've got your prism glasses on, your brain doesn't really need to change because you'll just like hop over, you'll smell the mouse, you'll eat it. You don't really need to do anything, right? So why does the brain need to change? You're like, it just continues. The world looks a bit weird through the glasses, but why does anything actually need to change? So then they showed that if you house the owls together, so you weren't just alone, but they were in a social group, then actually older owls could start to adapt because they're now having to sort of engage and understand the world around them. And then the final step was, rather than have them just like feed them dead mice, they fed them live mice. So they had to hunt. And then again, they found that their adult brain could adapt very quickly, but because it needed to, out of necessity, right? You had to be able to figure out where the mouse was to be able to hunt it. And then the brain started to shift to sort of re-represent the world now in this slightly shifted manner. And what this really just kind of tells us is that it's this continuous engagement with the world that allows our brains to change regardless of how old we are. And it was like really nicely shown in these owl experiments. And then, there's actually even older examples in humans where they give them these prism glasses. And so I have this excerpt from one of these studies where an individual was given glasses that completely flipped the world upside down. So this is an adult, and for like 5 days, they're like tripping over everything. They're trying to like walk on the ceiling and they can't really do anything. But then by like engaging with the world, like they had them riding tricycles and drawing and fencing and doing all these things that sort of requires them to engage with the world, their vision flipped upside down within a few days. So like within a few days, even though their glasses are telling them that the world is the wrong way around, it just adapted so that everything looked the right way around. But again, that required them to like continuously engage with the environment. So all of this tells us that our brains can actually change a huge amount, even as adults, but it requires us to like give our brains a reason to change and to continue to engage in the world in some way.
I guess this boils down to making sure that we try keep, it's hard because I feel like our environments are so complex. Like we live in a very stimulated world. So is there a difference of living in a hyper-stimulated world that ultimately a lot of people say like we're killing our brain cells because we're overstimulated, but creating stimulated environments that aren't overstimulating us?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question because, and it's one of the reasons why I quite like the fact that the book is called The Stimulated Mind, and it wasn't my title. It was my editor came up with the title, because most people would be like, but wait, aren't we like overstimulated? Like, why is that? Isn't that a bad thing? And I think it comes down to what these stimuli really are, and then the change, sort of like the downstream changes that they create. So what we're doing less of is engaging with the real world in real life, learning complex skills with real people, doing difficult things where we fail and make mistakes and learn. And like, that's what really drives these sort of big changes in the brain. And what we're doing more of is just continuous low-level task switching, distraction, low-level stress, constant meetings, never actually taking time to switch off. And so like the stimuli that we have are much less complex, but they also never stop. And so one really critical part of stimulating your brain from a beneficial standpoint is that you need then time to recover and adapt afterwards. So it's exactly like, going to the gym and lifting weights or running, sprinting. Everybody knows you don't get stronger and fitter in the gym. You get stronger and fitter when you recover afterwards, right? And that's why professional athletes spend so much time investing in recovery, because that's really where you sort of make the physical adaptations and the physical gains. And so this is why, when you asked me earlier, is sleep the most underrated tool for brain health? I sort of ummed and ahed, because sleep is so critical. It's this time when your brain does adapt and recover from all the complex stimuli that we give it. But I think that the right type of cognitive stimulus is probably the most underrated sort of tool for maintaining or building brain health. But it doesn't work unless you sleep and take time to rest and recover afterwards, because that's when the adaptation happens.
Because that's your second part of the 3 S's. And I think the thing with sleep, I mean, I've just been in like 2 weeks of England, LA, Mexico, LA, New York. And I'm talking now about sleep. Ironic. But I think it's about the quality, right? The quality of the sleep is the important part, because you could have 8 hours sleep, but you might not be getting good quality sleep. And you might be using sleeping aids and all of that type of stuff to get you to sleep. So I guess, like, is it really important about the quality of the sleep or the duration of the sleep?
So there are several sort of fundamental parts of sleep that are important. And that's both those things that you're talking about just then, but then also like the actual mechanics of the different stages of sleep and how they sort of interact. And all of this is important. And you're right that we do need to attend to them. But hopefully we'll come back to the fact that, that thing that you just mentioned doesn't have to be this thing that we then get really concerned and worried about. Because what has kind of happened in a lot of spheres is that we've become so hyper-focused on sleep and so hyper-focused on data and wearables that we spend all our time worrying about our sleep. And then I think that can have a negative effect.
There's now research to show that actually the one time the wearable actually isn't that helpful is when you obsess over sleep.
Exactly. Yeah. Orthorexia. They've had to create a term for it. Orthorexia is for food. Yeah, orthosomnia is for sleep. But so there are technically 4 sort of parts of sleep that we can think about: quality, quantity, regularity, and timing. I don't talk about timing that much because timing isn't something that most of us necessarily have a huge amount of control over. And so the timing part is, when do you sleep relative to your chronotype? And everybody has slightly different chronotypes. Some of that is influenced by the environment. Some of that is influenced by genetics. But you have a job that happens at a certain time, and you have kids and responsibilities and things. So it's like, it's not always possible for most people to actually sleep in perfect time with their chronotype. I don't think so. I don't focus on that as much, but I think we can get most of the benefit, if not all of it, by focusing on the other three. So quantity is the amount that you sleep. And the risk for dementia really starts to increase when you consistently sleep for fewer or less than 6 hours a night. So it's actually, you have to be quite sleep restricted for long periods of time to see really significant increases in dementia risk. 7 to 9 hours is probably the average target. Some people say 8 to 9, but I think the data probably say 7 to 9. But in reality, it's so different from person to person, and even within a person, your sleep need changes, right? I need to sleep more if I'm training harder or if I'm sick, right? So
women on her menstrual cycle, I need to sleep more in my bleed stage than in my luteal phase.
Exactly. So me telling you that you have to sleep 8 hours every night is not very helpful, right? Because that's not necessarily going to align with your own needs. So I think 7 to 9, and then the outer bound, sort of 6 to 10 hours, somewhere in there is going to be your perfect amount of sleep. And so if you're not regularly getting enough sleep opportunity to hit that, that's a big lever that people can pull. So then quality is the next one. So you mentioned, right, you can be in bed for 10 hours, but if you're constantly tossing and turning, you have a high sleep onset latency, right? It takes you a long time to fall asleep, or you're waking up in the middle of the night, then that's a big problem. And equally, like you mentioned, one way that we measure quality and how we know that poor sleep quality is associated with an increased risk of dementia is the other things that we do in order to try and help us sleep, like alcohol, antihistamines, certain other tranquilizers, most of which impair the individual stages of sleep. So like alcohol and Ambien cause a REM sleep deficit, a relative REM sleep deficit, which then can cause issues down the line. So quantity is important, quality is important, and then regularity is increasingly appreciated as being important as well, which is sort of a line, how regular is your sleep time relative to sort of your circadian rhythm. And we know that in general, deep sleep happens earlier in the night, REM sleep happens later in the night, and that's true both in terms of your sleep period, but also in terms of the clock time. So you tend to get more deep sleep slightly earlier in the night, and then more REM sleep later in the night. So when you sort of have more regular sleep, right, you're going to bed at a similar time and you're waking up at a similar time. That seems to be associated with the best sort of long-term health outcomes. There are some studies, they haven't looked at dementia, but they've looked at things like cardiovascular risk, and they suggested that regularity was more important than quantity and quality, but it's probably a little bit of everything, I think. But those are like the main parameters that we should try and address as much as possible. And I think that's, for a lot of people, they may have very complex cognitively stimulating jobs, they may be learning lots of skills, they may be very socially active, maybe they've got the stimulus part covered. Then I think the next important thing that's really critical is, well, are they giving themselves enough time to sleep? Is that regular enough? Are they giving themselves, the opportunities to recover and adapt from all those stimuli that they're getting?
Well, the mental offloading.
Yeah.
That's such a big one. So many people, even recently I was on a press trip, and woman was like, I've had struggles with my sleep for so long, and I wake up at 3 a.m. And Dr. Andy Galpin came on, who you know very well, and he was saying, we did a whole episode on sleep, and he was saying it's such a common problem, and it's the mental, it's the overstimulation, which is like what we've just been talking about, of actually like putting things down on paper and trying to create a system where your brain knows it's ready to sleep. Because I know when I have work, when I'm traveling, I find it really hard to sleep because my brain is constantly on, and there's like no routine.
Yeah.
Because my brain and body's like, what time zone am I on?
Yeah.
I'd be really interested to know if people that are like pilots have an increased risk of dementia or not, because they're constantly flying between time zones.
I'm not sure I've ever seen a study on pilots and dementia risk. But you would, there's a number of reasons why that why that job could be associated with a higher risk. It's probably quite, particularly in the learning phases, it's probably quite a cognitively stimulating job. So maybe some of that offsets it. But, there's the circadian rhythm issues. And we know that shift workers certainly have an increased risk of dementia. And this is essentially constant shift work. Plus, as a pilot, most of the day you're sedentary, right? You're sat down. There isn't a huge amount of space to move. It's certainly possible that you could see potential increased risk, but I don't know if I've seen that study. If somebody has that study, send it to me. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, please. I want to know as well. I'm sorry if you're a pilot listening to this at the same time. So the last one that I have to just touch on very briefly. We spoke about this in our last 2 podcasts, so I feel like we don't need to definitely go and listen to the other 2 because we did basically all on nutrition last time. Yeah. But I can't not finish this podcast without talking about nutrition, my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
We've both talking about this a lot. And obviously it's the third S, your nutrient supply.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because we align exactly word by word from what I've written and what you've written. It's like we've crossed notes, which makes me very happy when I read the stimulated mind. But you mentioned key nutrients. And I think we have a very similar view that it's food first. The quality of your food is really important. But obviously there are key supplements that can also help, especially if you're plant-based. You won't be getting your long-chain omega fatty acids. So you talk about long-chain omega fatty acids, vitamin D, magnesium, your favorite, creatine. And I'm also going to put hydration in there because I'm really glad that you put that in because we know that 2% dehydration already starts affecting our cognitive functioning. So when we're looking at those supplements, how much of a role does this play in dementia as a whole? Is it just good for cognitive performance, or is it actually key to reducing dementia risk?
I think I'll start because you've mentioned the individual components, but I guess I'll start by just mentioning the model and what it looks like, because this is kind of what the book builds up to, right? I have a chapter on each of these different areas that we talked about: nutrition, exercise, stress, sleep, all these different things, and sort of tools to kind of improve those and how they're related to cognitive function and cognitive decline. But then I'd sort of bring them together in what we call the 3S model. So the 3 S's are stimulus, supply, and support. So stimulus are all the things that we've talked about. And we can think about this very similar to how we would think about, say, lifting weights to build muscle. So if you want to build bigger muscles, you have to lift weights, right? That the stimulus is the most critical thing. You can improve how much strength and muscle you get from a specific workout regimen by having better nutrition and by sleeping more, right? Because so you get more rest and recovery. But you can't just take naps and chug protein shakes. You have to lift weights, right? And so stimulus is sort of the core feature of what drives the whole system. But then once you've stimulated the brain, in order for the brain, the networks that you're using to do the thing that you want them to do, they need to bring in more blood supply. They need to bring in oxygen. They need to bring in some kind of energetic substrate. So that could be glucose or ketones or lactate. And then they need to bring in the nutrients that kind of build the synapses and run the mitochondria and all those things in those areas. So that's the kind of the supply bucket. And so it's supply of nutrients, but it's also having a good cardiovascular health, so good blood vessels. We talked about vascular dementia and how that overlaps, intersects a lot with Alzheimer's disease. So that's why what's good for the heart is good for the brain. We know that's really important. So that's kind of the supply bucket. And then the support bucket, we touched on sleep is one critical area, but then also avoiding chronic stress. So chronic stress sort of creates this hypermetabolic state in the brain where we can't fully recover, right? So that's you kind of talked about the mental offloading and those things that kind of prevent us being able to rest and recover and sleep. And then avoiding things that sort of kind of impair that adaptation process, like alcohol, smoking, air pollution. There are sort of a lot of things that kind of fit into that sort of support bucket, kind of making sure that we can adapt to the stimulus that we get. But if we come back to supply, the way I kind of think about it is I kind of give this journey through a signal being sent in the brain, right? So you need energy and mitochondria. So you need, right, that's where a lot of B vitamins play a big role. And then you need the things that sort of make the neurotransmitters. So if that's acetylcholine, you're going to need choline. And choline is actually also critical to help build the actual membranes of the cells and the synapses. And choline is also sort of interconnected or converted into either serine, like so phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine, phosphatidylethanolamine. These are kind of like the core phospholipid head groups that hold your omega-3 fatty acids, hold them together.
And choline, for no one that people don't know, is like eggs, and it's in meat, and it's in all of these type of food sources.
And then you need some minerals that are important for neuromodulation, so like magnesium and zinc are critical. Vitamin D is really important for actually synthesizing certain neurotransmitters like serotonin. So that, just by looking at that very simplified process, you've covered some of these core nutrients that I think pop up again and again. And it's not just that these are important for sort of day-to-day cognitive function. We know that those who have poor B vitamin status, poor omega-3 status, lower vitamin D, if they're anemic or they have low iron, all of those are associated with a significantly increased risk of dementia, and they also compound. So there are actually now several studies that show that having multiple nutrient deficiencies or insufficiencies, so low vitamin D, high homocysteine as like a marker of B vitamin requirement, low omega-3s, these kind of interact to sort of like synergistically increase risk. And that's probably because they also synergize in the brain in terms of being able to, play all their roles in terms of just the function that the brain requires sort of on a day-to-day basis.
I have a really key question here because I saw a clip go quite viral on a podcast recently, and I'm not going to name what the podcast was, but it was hammering home the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is the best diet for the brain. Having a nutritional background, I know the ketogenic diet is amazing for children that have epilepsy. I know that's kind of where it started. And I think there's kind of a for and against argument for this, but what's your thoughts on the ketogenic diet for brain health?
I think as a starting point, one of the reasons why I talk about nutrients for the brain rather than diets or foods is because I just want your brain to get the nutrients. I don't care where you get them from, if I'm honest, right? As long as you have enough of those things to run the machinery, you can do that across any number of different dietary patterns. Of course, that's easier if you have a whole foods, nutrient-dense, varied diet, because you're going to get most of those nutrients that you require. We haven't talked about antioxidant polyphenols and things like that, which can be really critical as well.
Nuts and fiber, which is not very high in a ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
So.
And the other part then, so if we're thinking about these different aspects of my supply bucket, right? So there's the nutrient part, and you can certainly get all the nutrients that you need that I mentioned from a diet that is either ketogenic or not. And I think one thing we should clarify is that any diet can be ketogenic if you're not eating enough of it, or if you eat it in a certain way, right? So you can eat plenty of carbohydrates, but if you intermittent fast, or you have a short time restricted eating window, or you have a low energy availability, you're not eating enough food, right? You will generate ketones. So I think very specifically what we're talking about here is a diet that's very low in net carbohydrates.
And very high in fat.
Very high, and generally very high in fat. And you can get all those nutrients that I talked about in that kind of diet if you're sort of, again, get foods from a variety of sources, and you sort of like tick all those boxes. But it's not necessary for brain health. But for some people, it can help you to overcome other issues that have already come up. So we know that low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets can be very beneficial in those who have insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome. And in that case, your supply of glucose substrate to the brain may have become impaired, which we do see in some cases of Alzheimer's disease. And so then ketones may be able to overcome some of that. So there are settings where if your supply is impaired, a ketogenic diet could be one way to overcome that. However, we also know that if you significantly improve your metabolic health through physical activity, improving your body composition, maybe improving other aspects of nutrient status, right? That a ketogenic diet doesn't have to be the way that you do that. There are multiple different ways to skin that cat. So I am very pro ketogenic diets when they're, when they sort of help you achieve all those different things, but they're not something that's necessary for most people. And so there are some very interesting studies where they use MCT oil to, in individuals who already have some cognitive decline, you start to see improved brain energetics, you start to see improvements in cognitive function. These are still sort of relatively small studies. We haven't seen these big, large randomized controlled trials yet. But if you have impaired ability of energy substrate to get into the brain, then ketones may be an alternative that get in more easily, and you can sort of overcome some of those issues. So I'm not against them, but I don't think that they're magic, because we know that there's millions of people around the world who don't get dementia and don't eat ketogenic diets. So then, we haven't touched upon how they seem to be powerful in some studies with like bipolar disorder and some other mental health conditions. So I think there's a number of groups where ketogenic diets could be beneficial. I'm all for them, but I don't think that they're something that we need to prescribe to everybody. And sort of even beyond the diet itself, people have been talking about ketones for a whole range of neurological conditions for long periods of time, including myself. But it's sort of there's this promise of these diets and ketogenic supplements. We just haven't seen really good studies yet. Like I've wanted this to be a really big breakthrough, and I think we're still waiting for that science to come in.
Well, I think this is the whole kind of end to that answer. It's so nuanced, right? It's a nuanced topic. But I do think that then when one person dials a message so hard that it's convincing that that's the only answer, and a lot of them people lose hope when they don't get that answer.
Yeah.
Or they feel that everything they've been doing is wrong, which actually potentially not. There might be some really helpful things in there. And as you said, like we've had Dr. Chris Palmer on here, who I love, and I think he's amazing. And he'll talk about it for exactly what you were speaking about, like specific mental health conditions. But then you look at Felice Jacka, who did the SMILES trial, who also has looked at the modified Mediterranean diet, which is the opposite of a ketogenic diet. And that's also helped patients overcome chronic depression. So it's like there's so many different types of conversations. It really is like so individual. But I think when people hear one message, they think that's, I think we all do, because it's so convincing.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the nuance of it. It's like, we just kind of don't really know.
So even across all those people that you've mentioned, I think the sort of the core feature of all those diets is still, compared to, say, a standard Western American diet that most people are eating, you've dramatically improved diet quality. You've dramatically improved nutrient density. Usually, even on most ketogenic diets that people who I trust would recommend, very nutrient dense, include sources of fiber and polyphenol antioxidants and all these other things. Right? You're still including berries and plants and these kinds of things. Then again, I also know people who do very well eating nothing but beef, and I can't argue with that. Right? If you're eating a diet and it allows you to do all the things that you want to do and you're in great health, like I would never argue with that. But I think the main component, and so I mentioned the SMILES trial as an example in my book of like, here are some diet parameters that you can start to move towards, because actually they're very easy to achieve, and they will all significantly improve nutrient density, decrease calorie density, and improve diet quality overall. And so the common component of all those diets, be it ketogenic, plant-based, Mediterranean, I don't think any of them is individually magic. Everybody talks about the MIND diet, the Mediterranean diet for brain health, but in reality, when they've done studies looking at individual components of those sort of like broader dietary patterns, there's no one food that explains the magic of the Mediterranean diet, right? It's the fact that it's nutrient dense, much less calorie dense than, say, a standard American diet, very, much less ultra processed foods, it's much less hyperpalatable, much harder to overeat, right? All these things are important. And so I think actually there's a lot more commonality across these diets. As long as you don't argue about carbs versus fats too much, which I think humans actually are adapted to both ends of that spectrum just fine, as long as you're hitting those other things.
Yeah, I mean, it is the most polarizing topic online. Everyone's got something to say. But I don't know, I want to say we can all equally agree that reducing ultra-processed foods is probably the best step forward, but somebody will comment and say, no, it's not. So I'm like,
well,
I can understand
that too, because protein powder is an ultra-processed food, right? But if that's helping somebody achieve a certain goal, you know, getting enough protein is certainly important. Ultra processing might involve adding in a bunch of vitamins, right, and fortifying it, and then actually it's even better for you. So I can understand why people.
It's so
I can
hard
understand
because
why people kind of get into it.
I guess my brain is like processed, and then you have ultra processed, and it's hard because I guess the overarching is like you cut out crisps and cake, and fizzy drinks, basically,
yeah, exactly,
as things that just don't have any nutritional value in, but. It's always going to be a polarizing topic of conversation. Everyone's got something to say in this space, and I always want to hear it. So I guess like the big takeaway for me from reading the book, from talking to you today, is that although, well, first of all, dementia is actually declining, not rising.
The age-specific incidence of dementia is declining.
Yes.
The overall burden of dementia is increasing.
Okay. But there was one piece of hope in that first opening sentence, which I think is great. You know, that we need to be cognitive stimulated, but not overstimulated in the wrong way of doom scrolling, but like pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone, actually. And you said, I didn't pick up on it, but you said the word failure.
Yeah.
And actually, I've come to learn that's been one of my greatest lessons. For me, like, you know, going through this podcast, I failed so many times in so many different domains, but actually it's made me feel way more resilient and stronger. And so like pushing that. And I did speak to my parents before this conversation. I felt like I was being a little bit preachy, but you know, you do have that fear with your parents that once they retire, they slow down. So really like understanding what that is and like how you can push yourself to stimulate your brain and so many different ways. And also, you know, social interaction and things like that. Sleep and recovery, as you were saying, how important that is. Really have to think about my sleep routine at the moment, but also like nutrient supply and, you know, making sure, I mean, this podcast talks a lot about nutrition. So I feel like hopefully our listeners are like, you know, all kind of connected to that side of things. But it's just, there's hope that actually sometimes dementia, the overarching conversation of dementia or neurodegeneration, feels like a life sentence to so many people and to their family. And actually now having the conversations that there's so much hope that you can work on prevention doesn't mean that you can prevent every single one, but there are such big lifestyle factors and levers that you can push and pull to try in so many different domains, gives it so much more hope than maybe we had before. I think that's like actually what's really exciting about this.
The most important takeaway is knowing that we actually have a lot more control over this than we might traditionally think. And you're right that we have to think in probabilities rather than certainties. And so like anytime I say exercise decreases dementia risk or, you know, stopping smoking decreases dementia risk, then somebody will say, well, you know, my granddad exercised a bunch and he still got dementia. And that's very sad. And like, I'm not trying to minimize that, but we know that at a population level, these things are really important. And we can dramatically decrease our individual risk. But if we all change these things, we could have a massive impact on overall dementia cases, dementia burden. And we also need to remember that even though, you know, some of these studies are now just ongoing, by doing these same things, even if we do experience some cognitive decline, even if we do end up experiencing dementia, we can have fewer symptoms or improve symptoms by continuing to engage in these things. So even if you're unfortunate enough for a family member to get dementia, despite doing some of these things, it may have happened later. They may have had less severe symptoms. You know, it may have been, you know, less of a significant decline than it would have been otherwise. So I think there's a huge amount that we can do, and I'm very, very hopeful that actually it doesn't require a huge amount. It doesn't require a huge amount of supplements or anything else. That, you know, sleep, physical activity, you know, all those things related to cognitive stimulus that we talked about can have a massive impact.
Yeah.
But equally, there's probably a lot that we have to do at a societal level as well, because if we really wanted to reduce the impact of dementia as much as possible, we would need to make education accessible to everybody, and we would need to, you know, make sure that everybody got access to the best possible healthcare and, you know, access to as sort of a stimulating environments as we possibly can. And we know that socioeconomic status plays a huge role here. So we just have to acknowledge that. And so hopefully there'll be some societal shifts at the same time.
I think there will be. And I guess like without this being like another full answer, just so I know of our time, a lot of people are just saying dementia will be cured in like 10 years. Do you agree with that? There's going to be like a pill or
No.
medication? No.
No. I would love to be proved wrong. Don't get me wrong. But the current therapies that we have and the current targets that we have just, they only have very incremental benefit. And maybe it's, some people argue that we're starting too late. If you're starting to treat Alzheimer's once you already have Alzheimer's, maybe you should have been treating it 20 or 30 years earlier. These things are all possible. But I think because we talked about reductionism right at the beginning of the podcast, because we've taken such a reductionist view of dementia, largely focusing on amyloid and tau burden in the brain, which are a part of it, but they're not everything. I think we're kind of holding ourselves back because we become so focused on just one small set of targets.
Right.
Whereas all the things that we talked about today have a huge number of targets and a huge number of effects across the brain and the body, and that's probably why they're so impactful. So,
well, that's helpful because actually that's lifestyle and that's not drugs.
Yeah.
So that's also another added benefit because you don't really get side effects.
But equally, I would say that, so imagine a scenario, we haven't talked a lot about amyloid and tau, right? These are the proteins that sort of accumulate in the brain and are misfolded, in individuals with Alzheimer's disease and certain other dementias and actually certain other neurological conditions. And by removing those things, because they can have a direct negative impact, they can be neurotoxic, right? They sort of like can kill neurons and other cells in the brain, cause chronic neuroinflammation. If you had a drug that removed those things, and we actually do have drugs that remove those things, you would still need stimulus and these other things in order to promote repair and function, right? So even if we have drugs that have a huge impact on dementia, which I hope that we do someday, right? I would love dementia to be eradicated as a disease. I still think that these things are going to be important because if you remove some major disease-causing process, if you want to then create function again, that's basically going to have to come through stimulus and nutrition and all these other things that we've talked about. Sleep is going to remain critical regardless of the therapies that we have. So even as therapies improve, I think all the things we talked about today are going to remain really relevant.
Are going to be really key. Well, it's similar to SSRIs, right? We can also treat depression, but it's also really important to make sure that somebody still feeling nourished and gets exercise and gets sunlight. Like they're still really important factors for mental health, even if a drug is really helping.
Yeah.
So I haven't looked back on our last episodes to know what the answer was, but I always leave with the same question, which is, Tommy, what does live well, be well mean to you?
I can't remember what I said before either, so I might say the same or something.
That's also interesting, whether you change it.
Or something completely different, so people can go back and compare. But because we've focused so much on the brain, I think what it means to me really is maintaining brain health. And what I mean by that is having a brain that does the things that we wanted to do when we wanted to do it. And that gives us so much scope to personalize that, right? Because what I want my brain to do is different from what you want your brain to do. And what I'm good at is different from what you're good at. And that's what's so amazing about human brains. And that's I think, something that we should embrace, right? That's a big part of this whole process. So that's what it means to me. And it gives us so much scope to do things differently, be our own people, engage in the processes and the things that we want to be good at. And I think that process of engagement is really what drives that whole process.
With the neurodivergent brain here, I agree. You don't want to be in my brain. Thank you so much for coming on.
Was that negative self-talk right at the end there?
It was. Well, no, I mean, I use it now as a joke.
Okay.
Because now it's a very abused term, but I use it as a superpower.
All right.
But as in, it's just chaotic in there. There's a lot going on. It gives me great ideas, but it's just chaotic in the best possible way.
You should have my friend Chantal Pratt on your podcast.
Okay.
She wrote an excellent book called The Neuroscience of You, and she's writing a new book all about individual differences in learning. But basically, a whole area of expertise is individual differences in brains and why that's so important and so cool.
It's so important. And I honestly think I should get around, because the linear system of school, I can't believe can take us out of that individualism of understanding our brains. It did for me. And then this show's brought it back, which has been amazing. Well, I'm very excited for your book to come out.
Thanks.
Simulated Mind. When's it out? When people can go and buy it?
It's out March 24th in the US, March 26th in the UK. It's available now from anywhere that you might like to buy your books. I always love it if people are willing and interested to pre-order it, because that can definitely help sort of the publisher and people think that, you know, there's interest in the book. But yeah, next March, it will be on all shelves near you, hopefully.
Amazing. Well, we'll be putting a link in the show notes that you will send us.
Yep.
And thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad we could do this in person.
Yeah, me too. Thank
in
you.
New York.
This was so great.
It was amazing.